I want to give you just a very quick overview of the series of the speaker series that this is a part of, and then an even shorter introduction to esteemed speakers. Those of you who have attended multiple talks in this series know that I'll never say anything that actually appears in our online bios. So I'll maybe add a couple of anecdotes or what I hope are insights into what they're doing. But I'm not going to tell you the dean is a professor at Yale or something like that. You can just look that up. This is the last in this year's series of Research Meets Practice speakers at the Columbia Business School. It's meant to attract both practitioners who draw on research as well as researchers who have a heavy influence on practice in this very broad domain where management practice intersects with the social interest, hence the social enterprise aspect to it. Past speakers have included everything from a historian who talked about the lasting influence of Ayn Rand on the American right, which among other things brought a lot of crazy people out of the woodworks, because it turns out that this is like a center for the study and propagation of Ayn Rand's ideas. Paul Romer talking about charter cities, Rakesh Khurana talking about how business schools have failed in their mission to create management of the profession. And this evening we have Karlan and Appel talking about what many people really think is the future of development economics. And really, it is the future of development economics as they see it is very true to the spirit of this speaker series, in that it really is about taking research out of the lab, taking research out of the ivory tower into the field and figuring out what really works in international development. Some people see it as a revolution in this field. I think it's the nature of revolutions that you never quite really know what's going to pan out or what's going to come out of it when you're in the midst of it. So far be it from me to make any predictions about the future. But it's really a very provocative set of ideas that I'll talk about this evening. I'll also say that, again, in the spirit of taking ideas from research and academia and bringing them forth to a larger audience, I'm going to quote one of my finance colleagues who, in encouraging me to write more for the popular press, said, we can't have Michael Lewis tell our story because he just gets it wrong. So similarly, what's wonderful about the work that Dean is doing and Jake is that, first of all, the organization that they run, Innovations for Poverty Action, again, just the name embodies the ideas that we're trying to focus on in the speaker series. But they have also written what is a wonderful book, which I would encourage you all to purchase and read cover on cover, that really tells the story of development economics as it is being practiced today from the perspective of one of the leading practitioners. So with that, I'll turn it over to them. I'm going to ask them to talk for half an hour to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you, Ray. So Ray left out one important detail, though. So Ray was actually on our founding board when we created Innovations for Poverty Action. So I also thank him for his help in getting us started. He was a unique individual for us on our board, because when we first started, we were obviously small, and we just had this basic idea that said that that here's a bunch of development economists that are doing research where we said, okay, we're tired of being, we don't want these ivory tower debates. We don't want to be doing, analysis that looks at poverty in some sort of monolithic way across countries. We want to go down to the ground and set up studies that really look from the ground up at the micro level data to understand how different interventions work and how individuals respond to different incentives and different interventions. And so we set up Innovations for Poverty Action with the idea of helping to create this type of knowledge. And a second part, though, was really important to us, which was that we recognize that as academics, we have all the incentives in the world to publish academic papers, right? But we do not have the incentives to necessarily take that information and really bring it to two different groups that really need it. One are the donors, right? We do work with the large donors, right? That's part of the natural ebb and flow and back and forth process of doing research, is working with groups like the Gates Foundation and the World Bank. But we do not have the right incentives or infrastructure or institution in place to reach out to the $200 billion market out there, which is individual donors and small foundations that are trying to do something about poverty. And yet, where do they turn to find out what actually works and what does not? And so the second part of IPA was very much about building out that communication link to those donors. Also, as part of that is building stronger links to organizations, to the practitioners, because anyone who tells you that they can do a study and then that's it is fooling you or trying to fool you, right? There's many operational questions that are important to ask. Any one of the things that we'll talk about here that we can answer questions about, that are written up in the book, might be studies which helped us understand that this particular idea was very effective, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how to scale it up now, right? And there's a different set of questions that one might want to ask in that scale-up process. So part of IPA was about making sure that the research doesn't just get through the sexy part and then published and then die, but that actually gets carried forward to some of the operational questions that need to also be answered, and that's part of what we work on. So that's basically the kind of the heart of what IPA is. We now have projects in over 46 countries, and we've grown obviously quite a lot from the first moment in which I sent an email to my advisors back in 2002 to say, hey, what do you think about this idea? So now fast forward to about 2007, and I got a blog alert one day. For Innovations for Poverty Action, not a blog alert, I'm sorry, a Google alert. And up popped Jake's blog. And Jake was working in Ghana as a research assistant. He was a Columbia grad. He was a math major, and I knew him as a math major. That's the Jake I knew. Was a math major who was now managing the field work of this experiment on interest rates. And for those of you who, I was reading his blog, and I sat there and continued reading it for about 45 minutes to an hour, which people who know me well and know my attention span never believe me when I tell them this. But the point is, what I read were all these wonderful stories about a fully engaged life, living in Ghana, living in Accra, interacting with people in the market and taxi drivers, and really reporting back to his friends and family back in the U.S. In a way that really captured me. And this is where I recognize that to get the word out about how some of this poverty work matters and what works and what doesn't. Right? I can write academic papers. I think I think I can do that. And I also think I'm pretty good at writing kind of layman versions that I can hand to my mother, and my mother would understand of what the research did. And I can say, okay, here's what I learned, here's what I tested, and but there's an element that one needs to write that when you want to tell a human interest story, which is very different. And that's exactly what I kind of saw when I read Jake's blog, and that's how we came together to work on this. And I said, hey, here's what I want to do. Here's these academic papers, but we need to bring this to life. We need to bring this to life in a way that someone who doesn't have any economics training and doesn't want economics training, and if I told them in economics books, they would never read it. Right? How can we make this stuff come to life for people who want to do something about poverty, who are smart, right? But are not going to want to see a book with standard errors and graphs and tables and things like that. And so that's how our partnership came to be. And so with that, I will now hand things over to Jake, who will talk a little bit more and then we'll come back to me, and then I'll go wonky on you guys again.
So what we came up with after Dean came to me with this idea, and we spent about 2 years working on it, was this this book, which you all already own or will own very soon, I'm sure. And so yeah, in some ways the title tells a lot of what the book wants to tell, and the title is More Than Good Intentions. So that recognizes that, as Dean said, $200 billion a year is donated by private individuals and small foundations in the U.S., and almost all of that giving stems from some genuine altruism. It looks like people really want to help other people, and so they're ready to cut checks. And so what we're interested in doing is making sure those checks do as much good as they can around the world. And in some ways that's kind of hard because charities are really savvy, and they know that we have these, whether they're emotional or reasoned kind of impulses to give, that's something they can capitalize on, and our heartstrings are pretty easy to pull in some cases. And charities have proven to be, very savvy at pulling those heartstrings effectively. So one thing that I want to read from the book is just an example of how easy it can be to give, and how it can become really effortless in a way that's almost thoughtless. You have an impulse to do something good, and you have an opportunity to do it right away, and you don't have to think very hard about where that money's going or how it's going to reach its final destination. So yeah, let me just read straight from the book and tell you one story of how this happened. So giving becomes much easier if you can enjoy the satisfaction up front, unencumbered by that irksome feeling that your wallet is thinner, and pay later. That's exactly what happened in the phenomenally successful Text to Haiti campaign in January 2010. In the weeks following the devastating earthquake, people rose up in unprecedented numbers and acted to help those in need. Small individual contributions, the vast majority of them $10 or less, piled up at an unbelievable pace. Text donations from the first 3 days alone totaled more than $10 million. Giving by text message takes a few seconds and is utterly gratifying. You type in Haiti, press send, and get an instant response thanking you for your generosity. You hardly have time to think of the phone bill coming at the end of the month. And when it does arrive, your $10 is easier to part with because it's tacked onto the cost of phone service, a cost you're already prepared to bear. Unless, that is, you are Kara. The following was pulled from a real Facebook page, and we did get this from failbooking.org, which some of you might know. Kara's profile said, I've texted Haiti to 90999 over 200 times, ... That means over $2,000 has been donated to Haiti relief efforts. Join me. So underneath this excited status update, some comments from her friends. Noah said, your parents might not like your phone bill this month. She said, well, it's not my money, ha. And then she said, wait a second, this doesn't get added to the phone bill, does it? I thought it was just a free thing. Aaron says, Kara, shoot, no, every text is $10. Oh, wow, are you sure? This could be very bad for me. And Aaron confirms, yeah, I saw it on the football game. They bill it to your cell phone bill. Another friend said, yeah, every text is $10. It said so when the Health and Human Services lady came on and told people about it on the Colbert Report. You might want to ask people to help you pay your phone bill. And Kara says, thanks for letting me know. Haha, Haiti must love me. So Haiti probably does love Kara. But, so that's kind of, it's a pretty innocuous story, right? In most cases, if we give money to something that's less than optimal, or we didn't really know how much we were giving, we probably still do some good out there in the world. But in a bigger sense, this illustrates a point about giving and how giving can be easy and how it can become sort of thoughtless or automatic. And we can actually do better than that. So if we start from a point of good intentions, we can build towards a point of making good impacts or maximizing our impact on the lives of the poor. And so that's very much what this book is about the search and the journey to find those avenues and those approaches by which we can make the biggest impact with our good intentions. And the sort of the approach that we take to take readers on that journey is this kind of two-pronged approach. The first prong has to do with evaluation. That means learning which programs in the field work and which don't work. And that's what Ray talked about and what Dean has done so much with Innovations for Poverty Action is actually getting out into the field, getting on the ground, and rigorously evaluating programs as they're implemented in the real world. So that process of evaluation is the first prong. And the second prong is understanding human behavior. So that doesn't tell us so much about whether program X in country A is working right now, but it helps us think about how we can design or how we can tweak future programs or future instances of a given program in ways that respond to the way that people actually think and actually behave. So some of the understanding about human behavior comes straight from classical economics, sort of the usual weighing costs and benefits and trying to maximize your expected utility and sort of very standard mechanical econ thinking. Then there's a whole second dimension which is now coming to the forefront, and that comes to us largely from behavioral economics and from the intersection of kind of behavioral psychology and economic analysis, where we look at instances where people are less than fully rational. And these are things that we can all relate to, things like when you want to lose weight but you still occasionally sneak a candy bar, or when you're trying to save money but you still splurge on a dinner once in a while. You know, all kinds of examples from our own lives and from everyone else's lives we can point to where we don't behave according to the classical economics model. And so integrating some of the insights from behavioral economics is kind of that's the spice that makes this approach a little bit new and a little different. So it's kind of, in fact, neither of those two prongs, either rigorous evaluation or behavioral insights in general, are really new. I mean, they've been around and been developed over the past few decades. But the idea that these should be applied to the problems of poverty is kind of new. And so there's one more thing I'd like to read from the book, which is about a woman who worked for me as a cleaning lady when I lived in Ghana. And she had this experience which would be familiar and understandable to a lot of us if we thought of this person as someone here in New York or in the US. But when we know that she's a poor Ghanaian cleaning lady, it seems a little strange. So I'm going to read it, and then I'll talk for just a minute about why I think it's relevant. So, and one other note. So I'm going to read this, and when you read in your books that you're going to purchase all now in 30 minutes, you're going to read a lot of I and Jake. And so I'm Jake, and Dean is I. We wrote this book together, and this book has a lot, takes a lot from both of our experiences. But in order to make it easy to read, we wrote it in a single voice, and that voice is Dean's. But as I'm reading a story about me, I'm going to fill in the Jakes with I's. So for just over a year, I lived in a tidy compound house on Ring Road in Accra, Ghana. On a friend's recommendation, I hired a housekeeper to clean and do laundry twice a week. Her name was Elizabeth, and in January 2008, she hurt her leg. I found out about the incident a few weeks after it happened, when I called Elizabeth to ask why she hadn't been coming by the house to clean. I said, "Elizabeth, I haven't been seeing you recently." "Oh, Brother Jake, I'm sorry I haven't been coming. I broke my leg." I said, "Oh, Elizabeth, what happened?" "I was at the market and I fell inside of a ditch." I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Have you seen a doctor?" "Yes, I went to the hospital." "And the doctor told you your leg is broken?" "Yes," she said. "He said I have twisted it near the foot." "Oh, so it's twisted. But is the bone itself broken?" She said, "Yes, the bone is not broken." So we had reached the limit of our ability to communicate over the phone, and it was clear we would need the benefit of hand gestures to get the point across. Elizabeth said she was well enough to come the following Monday to clean, then she would tell me the whole story. When I came home from work the following Monday, I found her sitting on the front porch. Her left leg was extended awkwardly in front of her, swollen below the knee, and wrapped tightly in a ratty ace bandage from the shin down to the foot. She wore her usual wide smile and greeted me kindly. As we talked, she described the accident. She had been at an outdoor market, crossing a ditch on a wide plank that had been laid as a bridge. The plank broke under her, and she fell a few feet onto the gravelly dirt below. Her 2-year-old son, Godswill, cinched tightly to her back by a fabric wrap in the typical Ghanaian fashion, was lucky not to be crushed. So you have to know that Ghanaian women almost always carry their babies like as if in a backpack. They just use a fabric, like a cloth wrap, to keep them on their back. So she fell into this ditch and, like rolled back onto her back, and fortunately didn't crush her son in the process. A few days later, she went to the hospital, where the doctor suggested a few possible courses of treatment. Elizabeth chose the most traditional. She went to see an herbalist. He put her on a regimen of daily applications of a topical cream and weekly checkups. The whole package cost 60 cedis, which is about $60 per month, which was half her salary. But for all that money, Elizabeth couldn't be exactly sure what she was getting. Herbal clinicians in Ghana rarely let their patients know the contents of the balms, salves, poultices, and tinctures they prescribe, because the ingredients can usually be found at the local market for pennies. Whatever it was, Elizabeth liked it, at least enough to keep taking it. When the first month was up, she signed on for a second. Unfortunately, her leg was not so convinced. After 2 months of treatment, there were still good days and bad days. Sometimes, when it was swollen, she had to walk on it very tenderly, or not at all. Other times, it felt completely normal and there was no pain or soreness. On days when it was swollen, she would unwrap it and rewrap it tighter. The pain on those days came from inside, she would say, pointing to the area above her ankle. It was a dismal situation. 2 months gone by, pockets half empty, and legs still a mess, but, one must concede, not a completely surprising one. If her leg was actually broken, then the herbalist's ointment by itself couldn't be expected to do much good. Whatever was happening under the skin, it was painful just to watch her. She did her level best to carry on, coming to clean on most of the appointed days, often limping while she swept, sitting at the laundry basin with her leg puffed up and jutting out to the side. I told her she had better go back to the hospital for an x-ray and a consultation, but nobody said it would be easy. Elizabeth went to Corlebu Teaching Hospital Monday morning, signed herself in, and waited. Around midday, she was told by a nurse that the doctor wasn't coming in. She should come back Wednesday. So she was there again Wednesday morning, name on the sign-in sheet, sitting in the folding chair. She sat there through lunch. In the afternoon, a woman came out from behind the reception counter and told Elizabeth she had seen her name on the sheet with X-ray written next to it and had watched her sitting there all morning. Didn't she know she was at the wrong hospital? X-rays were done at Ridge Hospital across town. By now it was too late to go to Ridge, though, so she should go tomorrow morning, first thing. She did. Thursday at Ridge, the doctor should have been in. He hadn't called in sick, but nobody could find him. Surely, the receptionist said late that afternoon, he would come tomorrow. In fact, he did come on Friday, and Elizabeth was there waiting for him. It must have been an exciting moment, as the anticipation had been building for about 20 hours in various waiting rooms over the course of the week. The doctor took an x-ray of her lower leg and reviewed it with her. What had been a hairline fracture in January had, in the intervening 2 months, opened into a wider fissure, which helped to explain why the swelling and pain persisted. He was adamant that a plaster of Paris cast was now the only option. Anything less might earn Elizabeth an amputation somewhere down the line. This proved to be a convincing argument. She agreed to the cast then and there, though she would spend another 16 hours over 3 days in the waiting room before it was put on. So that's Elizabeth. You'll be happy to hear that her leg is finally better, as far as I know. So even though she waited a little longer than she should have, she did finally get this cast, and she got her leg fixed. But why I think this story is relevant is that we here in the U.S. and in the developed world generally are used to getting good service. We're used to demanding that we receive attention when we show up for a doctor's appointment. We sort of have a different mindset as donors or as designers of development programs, and that's this idea that these programs should sell themselves, or they should speak for themselves because they work and they're positive things and they help people, and so people should just flock to them automatically. We might tend to think that about a sort of reasonably priced Western-style hospital in a city like Accra. But the fact of the matter is that poor people like Elizabeth are consumers just like the rest of us, and they want good customer service. And if they have to wait in waiting rooms for dozens of hours, then they're not going to go to a Western hospital. They'll go to an herbalist instead. And so that sort of core insight, which I think comes from behavioral economics to some extent, is just that we have to recognize that there are some commonalities between us in the developing world and the people we want to help, in the sense that we sort of we think in the same way about many of these issues. The things that are important to us may also be important to the poor, even though from where we sit, it looks like other things should matter to them. So Dean will talk a little more about that sort of seeing the poor as a market or as consumers like the rest of us, and how that applies to the project of this book.
Thank you, Jake. Okay, so as promised, I was going to be a little more wonky. So one of the topics we talk a lot about in the book is microfinance, and the reason why there's two reasons we talk a lot about microfinance. One is just idiosyncratic about my research personally, because I've done a lot of research on microfinance. It's actually how I got involved in development. Was in the early 1990s working for a microcredit organization. And I was working on the operations side, and at evening I would be engaged in really exciting conversations with people about what we were doing and what the impact was, and nobody knew, right? And some cared more about this than others. Some were just like, I believe in what we're doing, or some would play, oh, we do know our impacts. And the first impact study that I ever saw of microcredit was done by this organization, and it consisted of asking people who had been in their program for a year or two whether they were doing better now than they were before they entered the program. And that was it. Okay? So, luckily I'm hearing snickers, right? So I don't have to go into too much details what's wrong with this. But this was, what one of the largest groups that was doing microcredit was putting forward, and putting this forward to its donors, saying, here's our evidence. And likewise, though, it's deeper, right? The decisions about how they were doing what they were doing. Should they build in business training? Should we do group lending? What price should we be charging? Should we do group liability, individual liability? All these other questions. There's no more rigor on that than there was to the impact question, right? It was all just, let's take our best shot, and let's figure out what we need to tell donors to keep the story alive. Okay. Now, so microcredit has clearly captured the fascination and the enthusiasm of millions and millions of people. And to be perfectly crass, it has been radically oversold. Now, what's striking, and maybe this is just the way the world works, is in the past 6 months to a year, we've seen the pendulum swing way too far the other way. Okay, so it's like couldn't we just come in the middle somewhere? Which is kind of where the evidence is that's where the evidence is coming out, which is the punchline I'll get to in a second. But it's not the panacea to solve world poverty that people had been pushing it as. But it's also not the devil, right? And situations where we have seen a lot of problems arise, such as India now, the prescription should not be, let's shut down the market and it's doing bad, right? We have to be more realistic about what it's actually doing. And so this is where in the book, we talk about the first 3 randomized trials that have been done on microcredit. And in the there's one study we also talk about in the agricultural setting, but that's a little bit different. So in the more traditional microcredit space, there's been 3 studies that our group has been involved in. 2 of them fit more of the traditional microcredit in that they were focusing on entrepreneurs. Okay, so one of them was a group lending in India, and the other was an individual lending program in the Philippines. But both of them are focused on micro-entrepreneurs, which for many is a key ingredient to what makes microcredit, is a focus on micro-entrepreneurs. Other things that sometimes people kind of think of as essential to be microcredit is a focus on women and focus on groups perhaps. But I think the most important thing that most people hone in on is the entrepreneur, which I think is really odd, and I'll explain why in a second. The third study was done in South Africa, and it was done in a consumer lending market. Now, if we just were to apply the Supreme Court pornography rule to try to label these things, right, that last one would not get counted as microcredit because it doesn't look and smell as much like the traditional microcredit. In fact, if we were going to categorize it, most people would label it more like a payday lender. Okay. So they were taking people who had jobs, who had to bring in a pay stub to prove they had a job, right? So, by definition, they're not targeting micro-entrepreneurs, they're targeting the opposite of the micro-entrepreneur. And they're giving them fairly high interest rate loans, 200% uncompounded interest rates on these loans. And there's very little credit check beyond, do you have pay stubs, and there's just a basic credit check. So some people are rejected, there is some credit check. So now, the irony is when you want to look at impact on income, okay, which is, in some level, there's, one of the things we care most about, right? It's the common numeraire. It's not to say it's the only thing we care about, but it's certainly something that is a common numeraire. The biggest impact we found of those 3 studies was on the high interest rate consumer lending market in South Africa. Okay, so now, there's a lot of things that differed across those 2, right? So one of the hard things with research, and one of the things that IPA is very passionate about, is the idea of doing studies in multiple settings. But it's still very hard to just take 2 studies in 2 different settings and then declare what the difference is, right? So I can report the facts much more easily than I can tell you the inner workings and the theory behind why this would work this way in one place. But what was happening in South Africa was people were getting access to this credit, and it was helping them cope with some sort of shock in their life. So they were able to, for instance, send money back to their family in rural areas of South Africa because of something bad that was happening back there. And if they didn't send money, they had to go themselves. Right? And what happens if they go themselves? They're leaving the urban setting and going back to the rural areas? Well, that means they don't have a job. They lost their job. Right? And so that was one of the mechanisms that was reported, for instance. But at the end of the day, what's striking to me is that this is not the microcredit that is proposed from the philanthropic world. Right? It's not sexy. It doesn't inspire us. But yet that's where the income was biggest. Right? It's not what we were expecting. And I don't take that to mean that we should go and be giving charity money to these organizations. Why? Well, this organization was very profitable. Okay, so they don't need charity money. And that's one of the striking things that we're now seeing in the space of microcredit, is that you have the donor sitting at the table with the investor. So if that happens to you and you're a donor sitting at the table with the investor, my hope is that you would look around the table and go, what am I doing here? Okay, and it's not to say there isn't some role. There aren't situations we could discuss that would apply. But what we are seeing happen in some situations, for instance, Unitas is a very large microcredit organization which pulled out a microcredit for that exact reason. They were looking around the table and they saw that the microcredit organizations were happy to take the investor money if they had to. They preferred the free money, but they were willing to take it if they had to pay it back to or give up equity. The investors were willing to invest, and the Unitas looked around and said, well, okay, this is philanthropy. Let's go move the money to something that actually needs a subsidy in order to operate. And the fact is, if you look at the impact of the programs, it was not showing to be the panacea, but it was showing positive impact. So if you look at, for instance, the India study, you see important improvements in investment in the household. In the enterprise. So there was some evidence of some of the channels that we talk about, but it was not leading to this kind of picture perfect world that's been drawn for us. Now, what we do see in the space of microcredit is stronger evidence on the microsavings side. So one example of one of these findings that we talk about in the book. So for a lot of times we've seen in the microcredit space the kind of this moving goalpost problem, right? The minute it was seeded that it's not going to save poverty, well, let's just kind of lower our bar a little. And let's say that we're just trying to help people increase income or cope with risk. Or then the kind of the furthest shift of the goalpost says, no, it's simply about empowerment and freedom. Now, when we talk about freedom, it's almost a tautology, right? We're saying we're expanding their choice set, right? Because now they have access to credit, before they didn't, so they're more free. And that's kind of hard to argue with, but it's also not so, at least in my mind, inspiring for philanthropy, for donor money, because I want to know what they do with that freedom and how important it is. The empowerment term usually is referring to female empowerment, which is often called gender empowerment. I've never quite understood why we don't always call it female empowerment. I think there's really important reasons that we need to focus on female issues in developing countries. There's one of the few things that development economists almost always agree on is that women are more likely to spend money on the health and education of children. But the term gender empowerment, I guess, is somehow more neutral. But when we look at the question of does microcredit increase female power in the household, 0 for 3 on finding this. Okay. But microsavings, we do find an impact. When we offered people commitment savings accounts in the Philippines, and these were simple accounts that allowed women to take some of their savings and put it into a separate account that was locked up until they reached a certain goal. So there's a commitment aspect to it. And we're going to come back to that in a moment as kind of the final point to talk about on the behavioral side. So, but this product led the women to have more power in the household and directed more of their resources towards durable goods that they cared about. So it was important economic outcomes that was the byproduct of having more power as well in the household. Right? And this came out of access to savings, not out of credit. So microfinance, we have to remember, what does finance mean? It's not just credit, it's savings and insurance too. Now, savings and insurance, we're much further back in terms of the evidence we have on how to do it than we are on the credit side. And there are other issues to deal with about sustainability on the savings and insurance side that are less problematic on the credit side because the revenue that's generated is on savings is not quite as strong. You have to either take the savings in to then on lend it to have that type of back and forth. So that's basically where we are in microcredit and microfinance, and that's one of the reasons why we're now, as an organization, focused very heavily on the savings side. We just recently received a very large grant from, or at least large for us, from the Gates Foundation to scale up a lot of our savings work, so we're very excited about this new initiative we're taking on. So I referred back to this commitment aspect, and this is one of the other themes of the book, is looking at ideas from behavioral economics that apply both to us in America as well as to people in developing countries. And there's 2 reasons why we do this. One is because they're interesting insights about the human psyche and the way we make decisions, and they apply to people regardless of where they are. It's not to say there's no like universal truth that we're like claim to have that's going to hit every single person, but there are certain patterns of behavior which you do see rich and poor alike. The other reason we do this, and it goes back to one of the points I made earlier about the way we wanted to write this book. It was important to us that this book was an engaging book for people who have no experience with development. We'd like it to also be read by people with experience in development, don't get me wrong, and we think it's engaging there too. You'll be up the curve a bit more in terms of some of the context. But for someone who has no experience living in Ghana, living in the Philippines, living in Peru, we wanted to make sure that we explained how some of these issues relate back to us in the United States too. So one of the best examples of that, I think, has to do with this idea of commitment contracts and commitment devices, and how this way of thinking about how people manage their money or make decisions about their household, that same approach can help us think about how to get farmers in Kenya to invest more in fertilizer, and also can help us lose weight in America or stop smoking in the Philippines. And so there's three different things to talk about that all fit under this basic umbrella of commitment contracts. So what is a commitment contract? It's motivated by a simple point, which is that for many people, in fact, I think it's true for every person, there's some vice in our life that tempts us, that we would like to resist more, that we would like to not have tempt us, right? But we all have a different vice, right? It's not one thing for everybody, right? For me, it's peanut M&Ms. For one of my co-authors when I've worked on commitment, it was shoes. right? So we had a mutual swap on contracts when we were working on these projects together. So everybody has a different vice, and for some it might be managing their money and just seeing the daily expenditures, stuff just kind of flitters away in ways they didn't plan for, and at the end of the week they end up with less money in their pockets than they expected. And it's not any one vice, but it's just the day-to-day management of their money. So, in Kenya, there was a study done by which we offered. I was not one of the researchers, but we talk about it a lot in the book. But basically, prepaid fertilizer vouchers were offered to farmers at the point of harvest, when they're flush with cash. And this basically locks them into investing in the fertilizer. And the question is, does this lead to higher fertilizer purchase? Because in a perfectly rational world, no one would want that, right? They should just say, well, no, I mean, something might happen. I prefer to just save the money in my pocket, and I know I'll do it, and I'll wait till planting season. That way, if I get sick, I still have the option of paying for the healthcare instead of the fertilizer, right? But if people recognize that, no, I'm going to end up flittering it away on things, so yeah, I'm going to buy that prepaid fertilizer, and it's going to lead to higher investment in fertilizer, and that's exactly what happened. In the Philippines, we did a study. This one is part of one of my pieces of research, but and that's also we talk about in the book, where we worked with a bank that offered people a very simple contract. First asked them, are you a smoker? They said, if they were, they said, do you want to stop smoking? If they said yes, then we continued. And we did a little survey, and then we said at the end of the survey, and we did a randomized trial, so half the people were offered what I'm about to say, and half were not. And we said, here's the deal. We're going to take, one of our employees from the bank is going to come to you once a week and collect the money that you were spending on cigarettes, and instead you put it into a bank account. Okay, so you smoke less, take the cigarette money that you were spending, put it aside. Once a week we come back and get it from you. In fact, we gave them a little piggy bank to put the money into. And then once a week we came and emptied the piggy bank. Here's the kicker. In 6 months we're going to come back to you, and we're going to make you take a urine test, a little pee stick. And that's going to show us whether you've been smoking. And if you fail, then we take all of the money that you accumulated in this bank account and we send it off to a local orphanage. Okay, we're not going to profit from it. We're not going to burn it. We might as well give it to the orphanage. Right? So we don't want them to think of that as a good thing. Right? If they like the orphanage a lot, then this doesn't work. This made people 40% more likely to stop smoking. Right? That's a huge impact on smoking. Now, only 11% wanted it, and that's good. If we had 100% want this, then that means that we failed in explaining it well, because not everybody really is going to want to stop smoking or think they're going to be able to do it, and that means a lot of people took it up who shouldn't have. Likewise, 0% would be a bad outcome for any sort of consumer product, I would say. Right? Maybe the business school people can confirm that. So it was very successful, but it was not a tool for every single person. Right? There are other people that might need something else to help motivate them to stop in the first place or something of that nature. So the third place that we've done this now is a website that I started in the United States called Stick, and that's S-T-I-C-K, a second K. I learned this when I was about 10 years old, helping my mother study for law school, that K is used for shorthand for contract in law school. And so it's stick with an extra K, as in you're going to stick to your goal, and here's a contract to make me stick. And so this works for weight loss or smoking or exercise, or there's also a custom goal where you can create whatever contract you want. So not everybody puts up money. Some people would name a friend. I could name Jake, and I could say Jake will be my social, it'll be like a social penalty, and Jake will simply get informed if I succeed or fail, and I don't want to fail in front of him, and so that helps me achieve my goal. But for some people, they really want the money. They want the money at stake. So they put their credit card out. They say, I'm going to lose £1 a week for 12 weeks. Every week I miss my target, I lose $10, $100, $1,000, whatever they want. And where does that money go? Well, we give them a few choices, but the most popular option is the George Bush Presidential Library. Okay. So we're agnostic. We're not playing sides politically. So that is the most popular. But we also give the Bill Clinton Presidential Library, to be clear. Right? So we're not exercising some sort of preference there. We take several hot political issues, and we take two nonprofits on both sides of that. We also, for those who are British football fans, Premier League fans, we also have Chelsea, Man U, and Arsenal as options. You can choose your most hated football team. But so this has been fun to watch, and like I said, there's about 100,000 users now, over 100,000. It's been a lot of fun to see, and some of the custom goals have been the most fun. And I'll close with a couple of those that are kind of amusing. And there's more of a list of them in the book that's amusing as well. So there's been a lot on the relationship side. So for instance, there's someone who wrote a contract to not date any more losers. And named some friend of theirs as their referee who can adjudicate. When you have a referee on the site, what that means is that's the person who has the power to say you failed. Okay? They don't necessarily get the money. They could. So a lot of people do that. You know, I write a contract. I give Jake the power to come in and weigh me in and collect the money. So it's incentive compatible. There was someone who wrote a contract to not cut their hair. I'm not quite sure about that. There was someone who wrote a contract to speak more slowly to New Yorkers. To foreigners in New York City. And one of my favorite ones, just because of the what it says about how because there's actually an important lesson in it about being realistic, right? People who write contracts that are overly ambitious about what they're going to achieve don't tend to work out too well, right? So you got to know your limits. The goal is to raise the price of vice and lower the price of virtue, but you need to be modest about what you're really going to achieve, right? And realistic. And so one of my favorite contracts is to smoke less weed Monday through Friday. So let me just close by thanking you all for coming, and also saying, we're very eager to have Q&A and tell us anything on your mind. And also just to say that, in terms of a kind of a big picture note, I see this, the book is really the start of a journey. I mean, it's, we're 8 years old, which is 8 years young, really. There's far more things that I don't know and that we struggle to say, well, I'm not sure what to say about this. We have one study. Well, we can talk about that one study. But there's so much more that needs to be learned about how to deal with a certain problem. And so the book is really, in some sense, about the journey of how we're learning these things. But having said that, I would be the last person in the world, even though I'm a researcher, to say, well, stop the world while we figure these things out. And so one of the things that we're now very active about helping is under what we're referring to as the Proven Impact Initiative. And it's our attempt to help donors from small to medium-sized foundations use the information that is out there when they want to take action, have ideas about where to take that action and what types of ideas to support. But that's a list that changes. And the proof of that is that the list that is in the book does not match the list that is now on the website, okay? Because we learn, right? And we update, and we change our minds when we get better information, and we try not to be stuck in any one view when better data come out. And so I encourage you, there's a section in the book called To Donate that gives 7 specific ideas. But the website is obviously the living beast. That will continuously update these ideas that go into the Proven Impact Initiative. And then also as part of that, we have the Proven Impact Fund, because there's a disconnect often between saying this idea works and there's where to send the money, right? And we're not keeping any of the money that's in the Proven Impact Fund. We send off 100% of it. We don't keep any overhead whatsoever. And the reason why we even have the fund, we thought about not even having the fund and just saying, here are the ideas, but the problem is it doesn't tell you where to go. And the second problem is we might be able to say to you, as an example, deworming is a very successful program that is in the Proven Impact Initiative, and Save the Children is doing it in Ethiopia right now, right? But if you were to send off $100 to Save the Children, good luck getting that to the deworming program in Ethiopia, right? But by having a fund, we can pass on, we can accumulate enough, and we can then have conversations with Save the Children in Ethiopia, and we can make sure that their 400 school program actually gets to 500 schools as a consequence of getting the money that we send them. So this is why we have the fund, rather than just naming, hey, Save the Children is doing this in Ethiopia. Why don't you send them a check and put in the comment section, this is for Ethiopia. So with that, I'll close, and we have a question.
How do you select your objects of intervention, or your subjects of your intervention effectiveness?
For the research?
No, for your actual donation.
Oh, the organization. Well, so first of all, we literally just started this fund. So to be clear, we just started it a few months ago. It's early, but there's two basic paths to doing it. One, and first of all, we have an open process on the site. So if there's groups that see the Proven Impact Initiative and see the ideas in there, and then tell us this is what we're doing, then we will work with them to help figure out, is this what are you doing the thing that we have found evidence for, and then we can support that. But a lot of the situations are ones where they're potentially extensions of what was evaluated. So one of the ideas is remedial education. We did this with this group called Karlan in India. And we know that they're doing more of it, and we've evaluated their program. It was very effective. And so one of the things we will do with the Proven Impact Fund money is send them money so they can scale up the very thing that we worked with them to evaluate. So in some cases, it's an extension of what was actually tested. In other cases, it's about, like in Save the Children, it's about identifying other opportunities where through the policy work that we do, we can identify other groups that are implementing that idea. Does that answer your question? That's not something you're right.
How does your due diligence differ from that of Save the Children? How do you follow up?
How do we follow up with Save the Children?
And how is that your method different from that of Save the Children?
Well, no, in that case, we're actually working with Save the Children, so it's synonymous. Save the Children is implementing through the schools in Ethiopia.
So then, if that's the case, how do you monitor your interventions?
So first of all, like I said, we're small right now. I mean, this is literally we just started this. But in that situation, I mean, we do have a staff of people that are providing technical assistance on how to scale up deworming. That is part of an initiative we do with a British group called PCD. And these are the individuals that are working. We have some grants where we're actually working to facilitate the financing of the deworming program at the national level, for instance, for the entire country of Kenya. And so we're actually the ones, but that's not what we do. There's a key difference there in that we're not using the Proven Impact Fund for anything that's our own operations, right? Because we don't want to have any sort of conflicts in that sense. But we have staff that are fully engaged in deworming, that are spending tons of time. Is basically all they do is work with governments and work with donors, and they're the ones who know the Save the Children group in Ethiopia, and so it's through that relationship that we are able to identify that there is this program, and the binding constraint in that particular context is actually the deworming pills. That's what they don't have enough of. And there's some politics involved as to why they don't have them, but that's a side matter, but the fact is it's a binding constraint, and if we simply get them more pills, they can give more children. Yeah.
I have two questions. First one, are you working pro bono? Because you said there is no overhead, which is kind of hard to fathom when you have so many people involved and so many complex operations.
Just the Proven Impact Fund has 0% overhead. IPA, when we take on a research project to evaluate a program or to do any sort of experimental evaluation, then we have a grant to cover our salaries. I personally don't take an income from IPA, but that's a separate matter. I don't think that's what you're asking. I'm executive director, but I am pro bono. But that's because Yale pays me. But IPA does have a chief financial officer, a controller, etc.
So how much of that goes for that research? I guess that's what we would call overhead. So do you have any numbers to say how much you need to spend on research and all these setup of these programs and paying people? And so do you have a percentage?
For the Proven Impact Fund, it's 0 in terms of what we pay for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So
we don't charge anything because I don't want to.
What do you pay yourselves? That's the question.
So not from the donor money, not from retail money. So if someone sends us $100, we take none of that. Now we do have people that want to see us set up a Proven Impact Fund, and they said, you know what, I think this is a great idea, and I will cover the salary of your staff to set this up. But if someone from Kansas sends us $100, $100 goes on to fund the program, and that's a key difference. That's how we're running that.
All right.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of. But the most important question, though, is that, especially when we're talking about third world countries, I think we are taking, let's say, the Western societies, we are taking loaves of bread out of them by taking the resources and we give crumbs back. So do you have any idea what's the economics of using the resources? Like we could pay them higher for the resources. Where do you-
May I intercede here? That sounds more like a statement than a question. And I
Okay, yeah, so
appreciate-
I'm asking him if
Yes,
he knows.
and what if you'll allow me to finish, what I'm saying.
But I didn't finish.
Yes, let me finish.
Okay.
I would like more to engage in a conversation about the topics that are in the book. And I would encourage the authors to act as classroom dictators in this classroom. And when a question is a little out of bounds of what I think the group is interested in hearing about, for them to feel free to postpone the question to afterwards, which I am going to do for that question specifically.
What's the value of the resources we're taking
I
out of there?
I
And
would
how
like
much money
to,
we
I'd
like
get
to
back?
move on to
Get
the
that
question next
We
to
don't,
now.
this is not, I'm not saying it's not an interesting question, but this is not what the book is about natural resource extraction. What the book is about is how to spend that money. So for instance, in Uganda, there's a huge amount of oil money the government has, and there's a lot of questions on how to spend that money effectively. And we are working to try to help them figure out how to spend that money effectively. Right? Same thing in Ghana. This is a big issue. There's a lot of oil money that has been, that is expected to flow. And the question is, how can the government spend that money effectively? And how can it set up the right governance process so that the money doesn't get wasted and is not corrupt? And that's another project that we're working on extensively. Actually, Bidwell, who's over here, is one of the people who works with us at IPA, and is spearheading that exact effort. How do you improve the governance program not the governance program, but the governance of the public allocation of resources, so that money is effectively spent in communities. So that's what we're focused on doing is on the evaluation side, learning what works and what doesn't. The book is not about the politics.
You do, there's a lot of work by different corporations. You talk about kind of the private aspect, but there's a lot of work by corporations in the developing world in terms of working with development in indigenous peoples and so forth when they have a project in a particular area, like let's say Uganda or whatever, working with them to get grants to kind of evaluate this is more effective at raising the standard of living compared to this over here. Do you do that kind of work as far as reaching out to private corporations to fund that kind of work?
I haven't seen too many private corporations that are, at least I've had a little bit of engagement with private corporations, but I don't tend to find that they are funding the type of research that we're doing, at least in my experience. Would love them to. If you know of any that you think would, please introduce us.
And it's also true that private corporations use this kind of research all the time for their own purposes, for marketing purposes and things like that. So randomized trials, which is exactly the methodology that IPA applies all over the world, is used constantly by credit card companies to help craft the most effective solicitations. And so all kinds of private firms use this exact method to tweak their marketing and their sales pitches. But yeah, maybe not necessarily to tweak their corporate social responsibility.
It is the case, for instance, the study in South Africa I mentioned, right? I mean, that's a for-profit lender. From their perspective, this was not an impact study of what they were doing. For them, we were helping them build a credit scoring model to help them understand who they should loan to and who they should not to make it more profitable. We also did a marketing study, just like Jake was saying.
But based on that information, you were able to figure out why it was actually effective.
Because we randomized, what we did is we randomized who got credit. And so that gave us the ability to go get grant money to then go do surveys. They didn't pay for the surveys because they were like, why would we do that? There is also an issue that does arise in the corporate setting that I think is two issues that I think are important. One is about the independence of evaluation. I have been, there's some major corporate groups that have pouring a lot of money into development that refuse to be evaluated in a way that where the evaluator has intellectual freedom. So yeah, I can tell you that we as an organization, and I personally, walk away from any such situation. And you can kind of understand why a corporation might do that, although I honestly do believe that it's not in their long-term interest either, that they'll get more kudos for doing it right. But that is the reality, that there are corporations that that get scared at the idea of an evaluation that might not prove that they saved the world. And so that question of intellectual freedom is a key one when you get into the corporate side. The other thing that I think is important on the corporate side is that there are, any corporation that is claiming to have the double bottom line type argument, there's a phrase that gets used a lot in the microcredit world called the market test. And there was an argument that actually survived for quite a while, saying, no, the market test is sufficient to prove our impact. And what do we mean by the market test? The market test says we offered them a product, they bought it, we're good. Right? People are maximize utility, so they wouldn't buy it if it wasn't good. And so the proof in the proof of our impact is self-evident by the fact that we are a sustainable entity that passed the market test, and people have demand for our services. Right? And you can say this in a way that actually sounds quite reasonable until you start thinking about applying this test to the cigarette and tobacco industry. And then you have to think to yourself, wait a second, I think they passed that test too. But yet, we would never sit here in a corporate social responsibility spirit saying, double bottom line, we're helping people smoke more cigarettes, we're helping them drink more. They're doing it because they're obviously happier for it. And I'm not actually anti-smoking and cigarettes. Well, actually, I do eat cigarettes, but I'm not anti-alcohol. But but the point is not that I'm poking fun at that. It's just that what I'm poking fun of is like we can't possibly be satisfied with demand as a metric for impact. We need to actually know what is the impact of a program on a metric that such as income or female power. If that's the issue.
Well, it goes back to externalities. And trying to figure out what those externalities are.
Right.
Because that's really
No, right, and that's
side of the equation.
no, absolutely. There's an entirely separate issue. Yeah.
So I have an observation about a comment that this gentleman made, and then a question which is actually quite related to your comments about the market test. So the observation is just that I personally used to, when making decisions about charitable giving, used to be quite concerned about the percentage of donations that go to overhead versus go to actual delivery of services. One thing I guess I've become aware of, apart from reading some of the book, but also in thinking about it more over time, is that may not be the right metric for deciding where to give your money because, for example, institutions that devote a lot of money to research on impact are likely to have higher overhead than institutions that do no such research. And so I caution against using that as a single metric for determining where to make your donations, and that things like the Proven Impact Initiative would seem to be useful ways to try to strike a balance between overhead costs and the value of that overhead. So that's just an observation. About the question, you mentioned sustainability twice, once in connection with microcredit, and then it was a second ago. And it strikes me that some of this work, in order to be sustainable in the long run, has to be commercialized. And what plans do you have to transition from charitable giving and research related to impact to, or is it any part of IPA's mission and role to attempt to commercialize those activities to make them commercially viable so that they're sustainable in the long run?
So I'm only interested in doing that when it's the right answer, and it's not always the right answer. So take bed nets as an example. And so hot debate in bed nets. You do it in a quote sustainable way by creating markets and selling them at market prices, or do you give them away for free? Right? The way that near and dear people here at Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs is a huge proponent of giving them away for free, and others are a big proponent of not selling them. Well, turns out the best evidence we have so far says Jeffrey is right. Give them away for free. That the usage is much higher when you give them away for free. That it's not true that you have to, in this particular context, that you have to pay for it to value it. And if the goal is simply to say, how many lives can we save, that it's worth the subsidy. So that's a simple example. And a kicker result, which has come out since the book, so it's not in there, is that it doesn't depress longer term demand. So if you get it for free, it's not the case that a year later that you're then less likely to buy it because you feel like, I thought this stuff was free. Why am I having to pay for it now? That they were still willing to pay for it later, and more likely to pay for it later after getting it for free. Now, for anybody who's gotten a free sample in a grocery store, this shouldn't sound so surprising, but for some reason, this is like a big shock to many in the development world. But that's a perfect example where the implication to me is no, you should be giving that away for free. I'm not saying everything fits that bill, but the point is, we need to look at specific situations, and there will be some things that, in fact, we conclude the right answer is a subsidy, and that's that. And if that's the answer in a particular situation, then let's get the evidence to support that decision, and let's scale that up. Yeah.
On that topic, the idea that if you pay for something, you'll value it more and then it's more effective. From BedNets, it kind of seems to be infecting other kind of interventions, and it's now been kind of possibly disrupted. Do you think that core concept is sometimes true? Or do you think it's a fundamental
and I think it should be clear. I think we need to replicate, and I think we need to see the BedNet study done in other settings.
Yeah.
That it could be that this was true in that context where BedNets had, certain usage rates and things like this, and you might want to go into some other area where there hasn't been national campaigns or education. So I would say it's maybe not even true just for BedNets. I'm always, this is one of the things that scares me the most about our book, to be honest with you, right? Is that, the reason, one of the motivating moments for starting IPA was saying, who are we fooling that we could do a study in one place, in one point in time, in one country, and then declare the answer? That's crazy, right? It's not even true that we can assume that the results are going to hold in the same country, in the same context, the next year, right? I mean, conditions can change in that way. So it's no, now that doesn't mean let's throw up our hands and never do evaluations because nothing has external validity. But it does mean that we need to see more similar studies in multiple contexts that are linked with theory about when things are going to work and when they're not, right? And that's, and so, I don't know that BedNets is different than chlorine, right, per se, but we might be able to talk about the features of the two and why they may be different, about one being durable or not, and then once we understand those types of things, might have some understanding as to when this sunk cost fallacy will take place and when it won't. Yeah.
I guess I just want to raise kind of a larger discussion point. I work in the impact investing space, and there's a huge conversation regarding creating a common taxonomy so that
Regarding what?
creating a common set of metrics to measure social impact across industries. And I'm interested, and you kind of alluded to it before, but I'm also interested maybe a little bit deeper on your experience with looking at proving impact in one sector and then proving it in another sector, and whether we actually can create a standard whereby a donor or an investor can say, all right, X metric looks good, I'm going to invest there.
We've had that, so your question was looking at cross sectors, but within sectors, there are some really nice examples where, competing interventions have been evaluated side by side, and then we can say, all over the same denominator, this one's better than that one. Looking across sectors, there are some, I guess, like income, what did we talk about yesterday? DALYs, disability adjusted life years. So maybe some kinds of common denominators that are meaningful to talk about. And then there's also a space of kind of broadly speaking quality of life measures, things like stress or happiness or more kind of psychological outcome measures that can also be measured systematically. And so that might be a way to look across diverse sectors. I don't know if you have something to add, Dan.
I would say that, and the other thing I would say is, there's a part of me which has a strong desire to do exactly what you're saying, and there's another part of me which says no. And this is the very pragmatic part of me. The analytical me wants to do that. Okay, the pragmatic me wants to say, if a school teacher wants to give to schools, who am I to tell them, no, you got to do health? And if an entrepreneur wants to help improve the entrepreneurial sector, like, why should I sit there and try to explain to them that, actually, health is really the thing you should be supporting because, look, we converted everything to one common numeraire and this one won. Their passion was entrepreneurship. Let them fund it. Right? So there's a part of me which wants to be the pragmatist and say, you know, it's not like we're going to go all in on one thing, who wins the horse race when we put everything in a common numeraire. And so, you know, let people have their passion for what they want. I have the same thinking when I think about geography too, right? So, you know, do I tell people that you should go all in on Chad just because it's, you know, much poorer than anywhere else? You know, if someone tells me their passion is Peru, well, that's great. Well, here are some ideas for what you can do in Peru, right? And so I'm a little hesitant on both of those. I see them very similarly, and I think the objective should be live in your preferences as a donor, like what you do. And if someone comes and they're working in a hedge fund, and so they think in the purely analytical way, and they're just a quant person, and they say I can just remove all labels to everything, well then fine, then go ahead and do that for them. But they're the exception to the rule in terms of who's donating.
Yeah, sorry, I agree with you, but I think in the larger context of just moving money into, at least where I'm looking at social enterprises, and by the way, I completely agree with your view, your pragmatic viewpoint. But the question is, well, how do you then move mainstream money into the field? And maybe this is getting outside of what we're really talking about here, but I think that maybe moving mainstream capital into the field requires a certain level of overarching analytics, just to throw it out there.
Dean, you had made a comment, and it was a bit of a side comment, about the microfinance in the 3 studies, and that 2 of the studies had to do with the entrepreneurship. And then you said, but that was kind of, I can't remember the exact wording, was like unusual or odd or something, that the microfinance and the entrepreneurship. Do you recall that?
No, it was the not exactly that.
Okay.
It was the third one that was the odd one.
Oh, okay.
The two that were doing entrepreneurship lending were more like the canonical microcredit. One more so than the other because it was also doing groups, whereas the other was individual. So, you know, everything's a kind of a spectrum, if you want to say, in terms of distance from Grameen. So the one in India was the closest to Grameen. One in the Philippines was close, but it was different because it was individual lending rather than group lending. But it was still very focused on entrepreneurs. And the one that was furthest from the Grameen model, with a huge gap between that one and the other, is the payday lender, basically, in South Africa.
I have a question about studying long-term impact. Also being in this area and even on the programmatic side, the value of some of this evaluation is really taken a huge step. But I think a lot of people still see challenges in studying longer-term impact, particularly in areas where it's maybe hard to reach people after a certain amount of time. And if you have any experiences around that, challenges, or what you think the area is up to.
Well, there's at least one thing immediately comes to mind is the deworming program, which we talk about a lot in here. Just recently had a follow-up, which I think we did get the follow-up in also, right? So about 12 years ago, I guess, 12, 13 years ago, the first round of school-based deworming was done in Kenya. And they went into primary schools, middle schools, and they distributed deworming pills for free, and they found that attendance jumped up right away. And then 10 years later, they came back and were able to locate a large percentage. I don't know off the top of my head, 80-some percent.
It was around 80.
Roughly 80% of the kids who had been dewormed, and also of the control group kids, right? So, and then looking at them 10 years out, they saw higher incomes for the children who had been dewormed because they had been in school more, so they had acquired more education and had higher incomes down the road. So, that's a good example. I think it's, to my knowledge, one of the early examples where this kind of randomized research in the field has really been followed up, looking at sort of medium and longer term impacts. Now, I know also Chris Uji at Yale is doing a long-term sort of panel data survey in Ghana, which is hoping to get at some of these same sort of longer run outcomes.
There's one very simple thing which makes it hard to do. Well, two. One is, it requires a lot of money and whatnot. But the other is that for some interventions, if the control group, if the organization is going to scale up the program, they treat the treatment group for the first couple of years, and then they get more maybe it works, so they get more money, and then they go into the control group, so if it's an intervention that is like let's say it's a community building intervention, well, that's going to be a problem. So actually the children stuff is easier to do that on. Why? Well, if you're doing a program that goes into kindergartners, well, then you can follow them up for long run, because if you're going to scale it up, what does that mean? It means you're going to keep going to kindergartners, and so that's a different set of kids, and so the control group in year one is can forever be the control group because they're older, and so they're not part of the scale up. So the children stuff is actually easier, I shouldn't say easy, but it's easier to do long run, and you don't need long-term organizational commitment to stay away from a control group the way you would if you were doing, say, some sort of community building program where you go in 2 years later, and then the control group is effectively treated now too.
So the social return to replicating studies may be quite high, but it seems like the private return to academics is relatively low. So you only win if you prove that someone who published well, was wrong. So do you agree that that's a problem? Do you have any suggestions about remedies?
That is, I think Ray might actually, I've been meaning to look for this email, but I think I can say confidently that I sent Ray an email back in 2002 saying, here are the problems. This is why I want to create IPA. Back then we called it Development Innovations. Will you please join the board? And that was one of the problems. And so one of the reasons for IPA is to have an entity whose institutional kind of mission statement is not, academic and educational and professors who want to get tenure. It is an entity whose mission is getting the answer. So that's the goal, right? So now what's the bottleneck still? Well, you still need the donor to pay for it, right? Because you're not going to get the academic professor going to raise all that money, right? If the academic professors are raising the money for their own research, not many of them are going to raise money for doing 7 replications. Now, I personally have, but this is kind of because I believe it. This is, I also started IPA, so I mean, it's kind of that's not a proof of concept. What is a proof of concept is when donors come to us and just say, we want to see 5 of those. Now, will you go figure out how to do that? And that we are now seeing happen, and that's a very exciting thing to see. But it does need the donors, the big ones, to get behind that, because you're not gonna generate that with a series of one-off projects. You only generate that type of replication by someone sitting down for the big picture, saying, okay, what are the contexts in which we need to see this tested? What are the theories as to when this should work and when shouldn't it work? And now, how is that going to influence where we're going to go and do these replications?
I mean, ultimately, the goal of a place like IPA should be to not have to exist, right? I mean, because an RCT isn't actually that difficult to manage and pull off. And so, what are the steps that you're taking to ensure that kind of obsolescence for the institution? I mean, are these methods being taught in ways that the institutions that you're working with will ultimately be able to do them themselves, right? Are we going to enter an era in which NGOs and these kinds of implementers are able to do it themselves, and then we move on to something else?
So, I thought you were going a different way with your question. So let me answer what your question was, which is actually much easier to answer than what I thought your question was. So what I thought your question was kind of, by all means, I would fantasize it being obsolete. And what does that mean to me? That means we actually have more answers than questions. And so now I personally want to spend my time and my resources doing things and scaling things up strictly and not finding out more, doing more research. And if IPA is ever at the point where we feel like, that's the case, then yeah, we would focus all our energy on that. Call me a skeptic or a pessimist. I'm ambitious about all the things that I think we're learning, and I think we're going to learn a lot more, but I doubt we'll ever get to that point. Okay, that's what I thought your question was. Your other question, though, I think, I just put on my economist hat on that one, and I think what you're asking is a question about firm structure and vertical versus horizontal integration at some level, right? And so you're asking a question as to, so there's research that's going to be done, And now the question is, what's the easier way of setting up contracts and developing human capital skills? It's no different than Google deciding whether or not they should have in-house management of their auction programming or whether they should hire this outsourced. Should they, their management of their phone system, should they have this in-house or should they outsource some component of it, right? Firms have this, and this is a question of coordination failure within firms, and this is the Nobel Economics Prize to Williamson a couple years ago was her research on kind of thinking about just this and what does it mean to be a firm, and why don't we just see, why isn't IBM, 140,000 individuals all just engaged in pairwise contracts with people? Why do we see firms, right? And that's how I think of your question. And so now the question is, if I'm an NGO and I want to do my own RCTs, what's the most efficient way, the lowest cost way for me producing that? Is it to build up in-house capacity, or is it to work with an outside firm that has lots of its own in-staff training, lots of internal capacity building? I mean, we do have very extensive staff training we put everybody through, tons of staff resources that people are accessing. Now, is it the case that we couldn't just open that up and then just tell other firms they can come to our staff training and do this? But you would lose, this is now just a firm structure, right? It's not saying that the research would go away. It's just saying that we would be organized differently. And I do think it would be less effective. I do think there's something to be said for the collective body of researchers kind of learning from each other across organizations, across projects, from training that cuts across sectors, and I think there would be, I do not think the world would be as efficient if what we saw is every NGO running their own RCTs and not having a collection. But I see this as no different than the question about why IBM doesn't outsource every little thing and has employees.
And yeah, to add one small piece of field worker hat talking. RCTs are really easy and simple, sort of in their design and in the basic concept behind them. But as someone who's spent a bunch of days, running around trying to actually conduct surveys and then trying to go back and back check the surveys, it's maddening, like pull your hair out kind of work. And that doesn't mean that that people from any NGO couldn't do it. They probably could be trained to do it. But there is something which, as a research assistant for IPA, I got to experience, which was having all these resources close at hand and having colleagues that you bounce these, experiences and frustrations off of. And it seems like there's some synergy there, and having a close-knit group, which, as Dean says, works across different sectors and different kinds of settings for RCTs. It certainly makes that work of actually going out day to day and carrying these things out, makes that a lot easier.
So I just signaled to Dean that there was time for one more question, but I'm sure there are other questions that will find their way to the front of the room in a minute. But since no one else is raising their hands, I'd just like to thank Dean and Jake for joining us. Even though this is where I live my life, I still learn plenty listening to them this evening. I'd like to thank them for joining us.